I saw my daughter wearing my wedding ring, and when I asked her why, she burst into tears. Just like that, without warning, without a prelude or sad music in the background. Any ordinary morning, with the smell of coffee still in the air and the racket of birds squabbling in the yard. I was making toast. Lucy was folding laundry on the table and talking about something unimportant, the school where her son goes. A bill, I don't know, and suddenly I caught that glint on her hand. My ring. My ring. The one Raphael slipped on me almost half a century ago, the day he swore he'd never make me cry, though later, of course, he earned a master's in contradictions. The light streamed in through the window, and the gold shone just like it did that day in the church, only now she was the one wearing it. I don't know if it was the reflection or the anger, but my throat went dry. "And that ring?" I asked her, with that voice of mine that sounds sweet right before it turns dangerous. Lucy froze, like I'd caught her stealing air. "Ah, I found it in the drawer, Mom. I just tried it on. Did you try it on, or take it as your own?" And that's when she broke. She cried all at once, like somebody had opened a dam. Not an explanation, not a nervous smile, just tears. I looked at her, trying to understand what the hell had happened, and the only thing I could think was, why is she crying if she hasn't done anything wrong? I got up without another word. I went to the bedroom and opened my jewelry box. Empty. Not the ring, not the case. Just the hollow, round and exact, where my story used to rest. My heart gave a strange jolt, part fright, part betrayal. I went back to the living room, and she was already gone. The tea was still steaming on the table, as if the whole thing were a frozen scene. I sat down, breathed, and there I stayed, staring at my bare hand. It had the white mark from the ring, that circle that's left after so many years of habit, and I laughed, you know? I laughed softly, because I thought, in the end, marriage fades slower than the sun. But that laugh lasted only as long as it takes a memory to hurt. Something didn't add up. It wasn't just the disappearance of the ring. It was her reaction, her crying, the way she didn't look me in the eye. Lucy doesn't cry over nothing. She cries when something weighs heavy. And that day, the weight was mine. Before I go on telling you all this, I'm so curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining my story today. I'd love to read you in the comments, because sometimes one only tells these things not to feel so alone inside the memory. I looked at the empty jewelry box again and thought of Raphael. Of his trembling hands when he slipped the ring on me, of how he said, "Forever," with that voice of his, someone promising without understanding what he promised. I could almost hear him laugh. And it made me mad, imagine, that after so many years he still accompanied me even in absence. I took a deep breath, turned off the coffee's flame, and said out loud, even though no one was listening, "If that ring doesn't show up, something worse will." And I wasn't wrong. Because that day wasn't the start of a search, but the start of a truth that had been hidden for far too long under dishes, silences, and the phrases we never said to each other. I didn't know it yet, but that ring wasn't only gone from my jewelry box, it had left my life too, and what came after changed me forever. They say love can't be stolen. Lie. It gets stolen, sold, and pawned, like everything that once hurt too much. And with that, my story began. I didn't sleep that night. My brain spun like an old washing machine, replaying every detail, every gesture, every word my daughter had said or hadn't said. It wasn't the first time Lucy and I argued, but something about her crying had left a deeper unease, the kind that crawls under, to your skin, and won't let you breathe easy. I got up at 5, with the gray light of dawn slipping through the window, and the first thing I did was open that damned jewelry box again, as if the ring could have come back on its own, repentant. But it was still empty, with that precise hollow where the story of my marriage once slept, that hollow that seemed to laugh at me. I put on some coffee, without appetite, and watched the steam rise. I thought of little Lucy, her chubby hands playing with my necklaces, with that innocence that knew nothing of guilt. I wondered when she'd learn to cry like an adult. The sound of the door shook me from the memory. It was Mara, my caregiver, punctual as a Swiss watch. She looked at me with that mix of respect and distrust she has that sometimes irritates me. "Rough night, Mrs. Elaine?" she asked, setting her bag on the chair. "I slept like a saint who died," I told her, without looking at her. She smiled, but from the corner of her eye, she noticed the jewelry box open on the sideboard. "Is something missing?" "Not missing, evaporated, my wedding ring. And you looked properly?" I looked in the oven. "And if it's not there, it's because the Virgin decided to take it." Mara watched me for a moment with that patience of hers that sometimes makes me want to scream, then came closer slowly, as if she were afraid of breaking me. "We could call the police," she said, "just in case." "And what am I going to tell them? That I suspect my daughter?" "No thanks. I don't want to end up on the local news as a paranoid old lady." She didn't insist, but she stayed a while helping me check. I pretended to search, but really I was thinking. There was something about all this that didn't fit. If Lucy had taken it with good intentions, she would have told me. She's always been direct, sometimes too much. But her silence, her sudden tears, her rush to leave, that wasn't the Lucy I know. While rifling through a drawer full of old papers, I found a folded, yellowed sheet. It was a receipt from a jewelry store more than 40 years ago, with Raphael's handwriting in the margin. "For Elaine, with all my patience." I burst out laughing to myself, because that man never had patience neither for me nor for anyone. I remembered the day he gave me the ring, a simple ceremony, with promises that smelled of cheap wine and borrowed flowers. I thought he was giving me a future, and he, poor fool, was only handing me a circle of gold full of silences. The phone rang, and I almost dropped it from the scare. It was Michelle, my neighbor, my confidant, and my daily source of gossip and laughter. "What's going on, woman? You sound like a funeral." "I'm missing the ring," I told her. "The one from the deceased?" "The very one." "And your daughter?" "Crying, like she'd been caught stealing the Bible." "Then don't trust it. Tears are guilt's detergent." I hung up with a mix of laughter and annoyance. Michelle has the subtlety of a hammer, but sometimes she's more accurate than a psychologist. I stared at the receipt, the jewelry box, and the sun's reflection coming through the window. Mara brought me breakfast, but I barely touched it. "Mrs. Elaine," she said, "you're sure you don't want me to call the police?" "Sure." "Well, then at least you should talk to your daughter." "I will, yes. But first I want to look into her eyes. Sometimes eyes say more than mouths." I thought about that all morning. Every time I tried to focus on something else, the image of Lucy with the ring cut across my thoughts. What was she doing with something so loaded with history, pain, memory? And above all, why did she need it right now, after so many years? By dusk, I sat in the living room armchair, the one Raphael hated, because he said it was uncomfortable, and turned on the lamp. I looked around and realized every object in the house had a story. The wall clock that stopped the day he died. The photos no one looks at anymore. The plates I keep, just in case, though there's no one to invite. And suddenly, a ridiculous idea came to me. What if the ring was just the beginning? What if someone was stealing my life piece by piece, my memories, my remains? Mara interrupted me again, this time with a different tone. "Ma'am," your daughter called. "She said she'll come see you tomorrow." Ah, what a gesture. She's coming to return my peace. She didn't sound peaceful. Of course not. When you steal somebody's peace, you take your own with it. That night I ate some bread and lukewarm soup. Before going to bed, I opened the jewelry box again. Empty, same as before. But this time, I looked at it with a different feeling, not only loss, but defiance. If Lucy thought she could hide something from me, she was very wrong. I was a teacher for 40 years, and I recognize lies by their handwriting. I went to bed late, eyes open in the dark, listening to the clock's tick-tock and the neighborhood noises. I thought about calling Lucy, but I didn't. I didn't want to argue on the phone. I wanted to see her, face to face. I wanted to understand why my daughter, the same one who as a child swore she'd never lie to me, had put on her finger the symbol of a love that hadn't even been hers. And as sleep slowly pulled me under, I thought maybe that ring had been keeping secrets for far too long. That perhaps, after all, it hadn't disappeared by accident. Maybe it got tired of waiting in silence, like I did, and decided to go out into the world to reveal what it had been keeping quiet. I fell asleep with that idea turning in my head and with a bitter feeling in my chest, as if the air had filled with unanswered questions. But one thing was clear. The next day, Lucy and I were going to talk, and if she lied to me again, I'd notice. Because I may be old, but I'm not blind, and because there are truths that no matter how much they hurt, I'd rather face than keep serving breakfast over a ghost. Lucy arrived the next day just before noon, unannounced, pale-faced and puffy-eyed, as if she'd spent the whole night fighting with her thoughts. I saw her from the window, and, instead of opening right away, I took a few seconds to watch her walk through the garden, look down at the ground, pause for a moment in front of her father's lemon tree, the one Raphael planted the year she was born. She had a bouquet in her hand, those cheap supermarket ones, and I thought, when someone brings flowers for no reason, it's because they're bringing guilt. I opened the door with a crooked smile. She hugged me without my asking, with that mix of tenderness and desperation that always disarms me. But the hug was too short, and when she pulled away, I noticed she avoided my gaze. I made coffee, I told her. The strong kind, the kind that resurrects the dead. Thanks, Mom. I don't want to fight. Me neither, daughter, but you see, peace lasts me less than an open carton of milk. We sat in the kitchen, the clock marking the rhythm of the silence. I waited for her to speak, but she only stirred her sugar and looked out the window. I got tired. Where's my ring, Lucy? Her spoon stopped cold. Mom, let's not start. We already started a while ago. I just want to know why you were wearing it. I don't know. I got nostalgic. Nostalgic for what, if you never believed in marriage or in your father? I saw her tense, swallow. In that instant, I understood there was something more, something she didn't want or couldn't say, and I felt a pang of fear. Not for the ring, but for whatever it was that was eating her alive. She stood up brusquely, as if wanting to end the conversation, and went to the window, pretending to look at the plants. You know what I think? I said, lowering my voice. That you're hiding something from me. She turned, slowly, eyes wet. Not everything has to be a drama, Mom. When you cry for no reason, there's always a hidden drama. Lucy sighed, exhausted, as if the years weighed on her. I just wanted to feel close to Dad, that's all. I laughed without humor. To Dad? The same one who disappointed you so much. Don't come to me with ghosts, Lucy. You don't understand. Then explain it to me, because I'm done guessing. She didn't answer. She just grabbed her bag and walked to the door. Don't leave like this, I begged. I don't want to talk right now. Sure. Better leave it for when I'm dead and you can't say anything to me. The door closed with a soft thud, as if even it felt guilty. I stayed alone, with the smell of cold coffee and the feeling that I'd lost something more than a ring. Mara came in a bit later, with a look that already announced bad news. Did you talk to her? I did, yes, but it was like talking to a wall. I heard her on the phone last night, ma'am. Lucy? Yes. She was on the street, crying. She said something about a loan, that she couldn't take it anymore. A loan? What loan? I don't know. But I swear, I heard her say, I have no way to pay it back. I can't tell Mom. I froze, my heart clamped between my teeth. Lucy was never good with money. She always found a way to get into trouble and wriggle halfway out. But this time it sounded different. It sounded like fear. And fear mixed with shame is an explosive cocktail. I spent the rest of the day pacing around the house, not knowing what to do. My head was boiling. I thought about calling her, but I didn't want her to think I was spying on her. So I did what I do best. Think and observe. From the window, I watched her car pull up in front of her place. I waited a few minutes, and when she went in, I took a piece of paper and wrote down what I remembered of her crying, her look, every unfinished word. I always do it writing, organizes my mind. At nightfall, I went to the living room and poured myself a glass of wine, even though I don't usually drink. I looked at myself in the sideboard mirror, with that face of mine that mixes pride and weariness, and I said to myself, something's going on, and I'm going to find out. Not out of curiosity, but dignity. Because a mother can't allow her daughter to sink without knowing why. Then, as if fate had a dark sense of humor, the phone rang again. It was Michelle. "Did you talk to the girl yet?" "Yes, but she lied to me with a smile on." "That's bad, Elaine. When a daughter lies, she doesn't do it out of malice. She does it because she's afraid of you. And what do you do with that fear? You strip it away with truth. But truth is expensive." I hung up without answering. I stood there listening to the tick-tock again. I thought of Lucy crying, the loan, the missing ring. Everything was connected, and I still couldn't see how, like those puzzle pictures where all the pieces are the same color. Before turning in, I went out to the garden. The night was cold. The air smelled of wet earth. I stared at the lemon tree, the one Raphael planted, and had the absurd feeling that he was watching me from somewhere, amused by my desperation. I laughed to myself and murmured, "If you know something, old man, you'd better tell me." But of course, the dead don't answer. I went back inside, closed the blinds, and got into bed. As sleep overtook me, an idea began to take shape. It wasn't clear yet, but it felt like a spark in the dark. If there was a loan, there was money. If there was money, there was someone else in this. And if someone else was involved, then the ring story was just the tip of something much uglier. I fell asleep promising that the next day I'd go beyond my daughter's tears. Because it's one thing for her lie to hurt me, and quite another to stand still while she sinks, dragging my memory behind her. The next morning I woke with that feeling. A dream leaves behind the one you don't remember, but it leaves your body full of suspicions. The sun filtered in weakly through the curtains, and for a moment I thought of staying still, letting the day pass, pretending everything was fine and the ring didn't matter to me. But tranquility never lasts me more than a sigh. I got up, made coffee, and while the water boiled, I started looking around with the eyes of someone who trusts no one. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't help it. Mara arrived early, with her silent, steady walk, and noticed my state right away. "You've got the look of insomnia, Mrs. Elaine." "It's not insomnia. It's intuition," I answered, stirring the coffee harder than necessary. When a mother smells lies, sleep slips out the window. She barely smiled, like someone who understands more than she says, and went on with her chores. I watched her from the corner of my eye as she tidied the house, and I caught myself distrusting even the way she folded the tablecloths. I felt ridiculous, but the thought insisted. If Lucy didn't steal it, someone else did. And if it wasn't a stranger, the list of suspects was short. I decided to test my own paranoia. I went to the living room, opened a drawer, and counted the cash I keep in an old purse. Everything was in order. I checked the bedroom drawers, the keys, the bank papers, the silver earrings. Nothing missing, nothing seemed touched, only the ring. That ring that suddenly had become the doorway to all my insecurities. Mara came closer while I rummaged through a drawer full of old letters. "Are you looking for something else?" she asked calmly. "I'm looking for my patience, but that seems to be lost too. Mrs. Elaine, sometimes things go missing because they shouldn't be there anymore." "Don't come at me with bargain bin philosophy, Mara. If the ring is gone, someone took it, and I'm going to find out who." She nodded, without arguing, but I noticed a flicker of disappointment on her face. It was a second, barely a shadow, but I saw it, and it hurt. I realized I was treating her like an enemy, when she's the only one who's with me every day. But distrust is a sweet poison. Once you taste it, you can't stop swallowing. At noon, while we ate in silence, the doorbell rang. It was my neighbor Carson, the ex-cop who retired 5 years ago but still thinks the world needs his investigative instinct. He came to return a pot I'd lent him. But as soon as he saw my tense face and furrowed brow, he smelled drama. "What's going on, Mrs. Elaine? You've got a case face. I lost a ring. A robbery? I don't know. And suspects? More than in a detective novel." Carson smiled with that childlike enthusiasm he has when he smells mystery. "Want me to help you investigate?" I barked a dry laugh. "Investigate what? My family? Don't worry, I'm discreet." Yes, I know about as discreet as a dog barking at 3 in the morning, but I let him in. Deep down, having him sniffing around suited me. Sometimes men only feel useful when they think they're solving something, and Carson was harmless. I told him the gist about the ring, without mentioning Lucy, and he got serious, took mental notes, looked at the jewelry box, touched the lock, checked the window. "This doesn't look like the work of a common thief," he said with an expert air. "This here is trust. And how do you detect that? By the mess. A thief who isn't afraid doesn't leave prints. He leaves carelessness." I didn't quite get it, but his words kept echoing. When he left, I thanked him with a forced smile. Mara came up with an annoyed look. "You're really going to let that man stick his nose in here?" "Mara, if someone stole from me, I'm not going to sit on my hands." "Not everything gets stolen out of malice, ma'am. Sometimes you take what you need, even if it isn't yours. And sometimes you justify yourself because it's convenient." She held my gaze, steady, without looking away, and for the first time since I've known her, I felt something break between us. I asked her to leave early, that I wanted to be alone, and she, without arguing, took off her apron and left me with a, "as you say," that sounded colder than any reproach. The house turned into an echo. I walked from room to room with my heart pounding, not knowing if what hurt was the loss of the ring or the suspicion devouring me from the inside. I poured another cup of coffee, even though it was late, and sat by the window. From there, I saw Lucy drive by, on the phone, with that strained look she can't hide. I wanted to go out, shout, demand the truth, but I held back. I didn't want her to see me in this mix of fury and vulnerability. When the sun began to set, I went out to the patio to breathe. The air smelled of damp leaves and guilt. Carson showed up again, as if my bad mood had summoned him, and said he'd been asking around the street, that nobody had seen anything odd, but that in his experience, the guilty are always closer than you think. He said it like a cheap movie, but his words stuck anyway. I went back inside, shut the door, and sat on the couch. I was exhausted, and still my mind wouldn't stop. I thought of Lucy, of Mara, of the ring, of Raphael, of everything that had piled up in my life without my noticing. I got up to put away some blankets, and, when I moved a piece of furniture, something fell to the floor. It was an old box, covered in dust. Inside, there were no jewels, only papers and a folded napkin, the kind Raphael used to keep in his pockets with phrases or doodles. I opened it. It had initials written in blue ink, J.L. I stared at those letters for a long time, a cold running up my spine. J.L. Not Raphael, not Mara, not mine. Jack Lawson, my ex-son-in-law, the man who'd made my daughter cry more than once. In that instant, I knew. Lucy wasn't alone in her lie, and if he was involved, then the ring wasn't the end of anything, but the beginning of a much dirtier story. I turned off the living room light, left the box on the table, and stood quietly, listening to my own breathing. For the first time since this all began, I felt real fear, but also something else, a new determination, the kind that makes you feel alive even when it hurts. I took the last sip of cold coffee, swallowed it in one go, and murmured to myself, under my breath, "If Jorge has anything to do with this, he's going to have to look me in the eye and explain it." And with that promise in my chest, I knew that the next day, no matter the cost, I would go find him. I barely slept that night, and when the sun edged behind the trees, I was already dressed, coat on, keys in hand. I don't get up early without a reason, but that morning I had one. Jack Lawson. The name buzzed in my head like an insect. Years had passed since I'd last seen him, but just thinking of him stirred up an old rage, the kind that doesn't dissolve with time. Charming by day and manipulative by night. The type who smiles while he takes your soul. I didn't have his number, but I knew exactly where to find him. A small bar at the end of the avenue, the place where all the neighborhood divorcees go to lament their choices and flirt with desperation. I walked slowly, more to organize my thoughts than out of fear. Inside, it smelled like stale beer and old tobacco, and the clatter of glasses felt like a sort of welcome. I saw him right away, seated at the bar, hair a mess, wrinkled shirt, and that smile of his, the man who still thinks he can get away with anything. "Well, look who came," he said when he saw me, as if our meeting had been planned. "Signora Elaine, always so elegant." "And you, always so decadent," I replied, setting my purse on the bar. "We need to talk. Is Lucy okay?" he asked, feigning concern. "That depends. Should she be?" His expression shifted for just a second, a tiny crack in the mask enough to confirm he knew exactly what I was talking about. I ordered a coffee, though the bartender looked at me like I'd asked for a mass in the middle of the bar. Jorge lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly, trying to regain control. "I don't know what you mean," he said, but his voice no longer sounded so calm. "You haven't understood anything since the day you walked into my daughter's life. Funny how every time she suffers, your name shows up somewhere. This time, on a napkin with your initials." "Ah," that he laughed, but the laugh came out rough. "I didn't know you were snooping through my papers, Mrs. Elaine." "They're not your papers, Jorge. They're the ruins of my house which you helped fill with shame." The bartender watched us from the corner of his eye, like someone afraid the scene might turn violent. Jorge stubbed out the cigarette and leaned toward me, lowering his voice. "Lucy only wanted to fix things, Elaine. You'd do the same if you had an ounce of compassion." "Fix what? Your debts or the lies you force her to tell?" He didn't answer, and in that silence I saw the truth written on his face. There was something rotten behind my daughter's tears, and that man had his hands sunk up to the wrists. I felt a mix of anger and disgust. I stood to leave, but before I did, I looked him in the eye and said slowly, so each word would stick, "If you go near Lucy again, I swear this time you'll pay for every tear you made her shed. And not with money." I left without waiting for a reply. Outside, the air was cold, and as I walked, I could feel my heart pounding hard. My hands weren't trembling, but something deeper was that part of the body where grudges and fears are kept. I sat on a bench, trying to arrange what had just happened. I didn't have all the pieces, but the outline was forming. The loan, the ring, Jorge. Lucy was trapped, and somehow he held the thread to that trap. On the way home, I ran into Carson, coming back from shopping. He saw my face and didn't need to ask. "Did you find him?" he said. "Yes." "And what did you figure out?" "That cowards age the same as the brave, only with worse faces." He smiled, but I saw a spark of interest in his eyes. He didn't say more, but 2 hours later, I saw him from the window, talking to someone in front of the bar. Always so curious, always wanting to be the hero of a story that isn't his. That afternoon, Lucy called. Her voice sounded tired. "Mom, why did you go see him?" "Because you didn't tell me the truth. You shouldn't have gotten involved. You don't understand anything." "I understand you're drowning, and I'm not going to watch from the shore." There was a long silence, the kind that weighs more than shouting. "Just let me handle it my way," she said at last, and hung up before I could reply. I stared at the phone, with that bitter feeling that we were no longer mother and daughter, but two strangers speaking from opposite shores of the same pain. At that moment, the doorbell rang. It was Carson, with his phone in hand. "Look at this," he said, showing me a photo. "I took it a while ago in front of the pawn shop on Matthew Street. Ring any bells?" On the screen was Jorge, leaving the shop with a folder under his arm. My body reacted before my mind. I snatched the phone and felt a lump in my throat, not surprise, but confirmation. The ring was there. He had pawned it. I said nothing. Carson watched me with a look between triumph and pity. "Told you the guilty are always close by," he murmured. "And I'll tell you the truth never comes alone," I answered, handing his phone back. "It always brings a bill." I didn't want dinner that night. I paced the house like a ghost, touching the furniture, looking at photos, replaying every mistake. I thought of Raphael, of how he'd tell me life is solved with patience, and how I never had enough. Then I thought of Lucy, of her crying, of the way she looked at that ring as if it held a secret inside. I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window. Outside, the street was empty, the silence so heavy you could almost hear it. I told myself I couldn't blame her without understanding everything. That behind that lie, There was something bigger, a desperation I still couldn't see. And as the wine burned its way down my throat, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for the truths to arrive on their own. If Lucy wouldn't tell me, I'd seek answers in the only place I could still find them, in my grandson's eyes. Because children, even when they keep quiet, never quite know how to lie. The next morning dawned rainy, one of those fine rains that seems not to wet you but ends up soaking you to the soul. And though my body begged me to stay home, wrapped in a blanket pretending nothing was happening, my head wouldn't let me. I got up slowly, made coffee, and stood looking through the window at the gray sky, thinking of Jorge, of Carson's photo, of Lucy, of everything crumbling in front of me, like an old wall that cracks silently until it collapses. I realized I was exhausted not physically, but from so much mistrusting, supposing, trying to understand what no one dared tell me. But then I thought of Tomas, my grandson, and I knew he might hold the key, because children lie to protect, but grandchildren still keep that clumsiness that gives them away. So I took my umbrella, pulled on my boots, and went out. Water ran along the sidewalks, leaves clung to the ground, and the air smelled of earth and fatigue. I walked to Lucy's building, where Tomas also lived, and rang the bell without thinking twice. He opened, adolescent face half asleep and startled, hair messy, eyes too big for his age. "Grandma," he said, surprised. "What are you doing here so early?" "I came to see you, have some coffee with you, talk a bit," I answered, trying to sound calm, though inside my chest was beating like a drum. I went in without waiting for an invitation. When you've raised half a family, you stop asking permission, and I sat on the living room sofa. Tomas fidgeted, not knowing what to do with his hands, as if he suspected I hadn't come just for the pleasure of seeing him. "Is your mother home?" I asked. "She left for work a little while ago." "Good. Then we can talk without interruptions." He sat across from me with a cup in his hand, and I watched him for a while. He had the same eyes Lucy had as a child, the kind that don't know how to hide emotions. I smiled to soften the mood, but it didn't quite work. "Tomas, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth." He dropped his gaze and toyed with the cup. "Do you know anything about the wedding ring that disappeared from my house?" He took a few seconds to answer. "No, Grandma," he murmured, "but Mom did it for you." "For me? What do you mean by that?" "Nothing, just, Mom said you wouldn't understand." I saw it there, the tremor in his hands, the guilt in his voice. He wasn't lying outright, but he wasn't telling the truth either. I moved closer, put my hand over his, and felt his quick pulse, like mine. "Listen, sweetheart, if your mother is in trouble, I need to know. Not to judge her, but to help her." "I can't, Grandma," he whispered. "She made me promise not to say anything. And in exchange for what? Her silence, or yours?" The silence that followed was so dense even the rain seemed to stop. Tomas stood up, walked to his room, and came back with his backpack. He set it on the table and opened it with trembling hands. From among notebooks and folders, he took out a crumpled paper and handed it to me. "I didn't want to, but I can't keep watching you like this," he said, almost a whisper. I unfolded the paper and read it. A. Receipt from a pawn shop, Faith Pawn Shop, gold ring with inscription R and E. My heart lurched. I recognized the initials instantly, Raphael and Elaine, the seal of my story. The receipt was dated 3 weeks earlier, exactly when Lucy had last come over. "Why do you have this, Tomas?" "I found it in the car's trash," he said in a low voice. "Mom doesn't know I saw it." "And why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I thought we could get it back. She swore she would, but I think it's too late." I was speechless. My head was spinning, images colliding, Lucy crying, Jorge in the bar, the ring shining in someone else's hands. I wanted to say something, but only a sigh made it out. Tomas watched me with a mix of fear and relief, like someone finally handing over a secret too heavy to carry. "Grandma, Mom isn't bad. She's scared." "I know, son, I know. But fear doesn't give you permission to lie." We sat in silence for a while. He told me, in bits, that Lucy had been worried about money for months, that Jorge had pressured her over something, that she'd sold things, that she'd cried many nights when she thought he was asleep. Each word sank me a little more, but also gave me a new strength, the kind that comes when you stop guessing and start understanding. Before I left, I hugged him. I felt his heart racing against mine, and I thought how unfair it was that someone so young had to carry the adult's guilt. I promised I wouldn't say he'd given me the receipt, and I saw him smile for the first time all morning. "Thanks, Grandma," he said. "Don't thank me yet, this is just starting," I told him, and ruffled his hair like when he was little. On the way home the rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray, just like my thoughts. I walked slowly, the receipt clenched in my pocket, feeling how that small piece of paper weighed more than my whole life. When I got home, Mara was in the kitchen washing dishes. She looked at me with that face of hers that mixes curiosity and caution. "You went out early today, Mrs. Elaine." "I went to see my grandson, and I found what I needed." I said nothing more. I went up to the bedroom, took out the receipt, smoothed it on the table, and stared at it for a long time. It was the proof I'd been missing. Lucy hadn't only lied to me, she'd pawned my ring, that piece of history I thought untouchable. But what hurt more wasn't the material loss, it was the idea that she felt so alone she'd do it. I sat on the bed and closed my eyes. In my mind, Raphael's voice rang clear, mocking, as if he were still beside me. "I told you love isn't kept in a ring, Elaine." I opened my eyes, furious, and muttered, "Shut up, if you were alive, I'd pawn you too." That little joke gave me some air back. I stood, put the receipt in my pocket, and decided that the next day I'd confront Lucy. Not out of vengeance, but love. A tired love, the kind that no longer seeks to be understood, only respected. I didn't cry that night. I didn't feel anger or sadness, but a dangerous calm, the kind you feel when you've understood the truth, is close. And when it arrives, it'll be impossible to go on pretending nothing happened. The next morning dawned with a deceiving sun, the kind that looks kind but only reminds you light can hurt too. I'd spent the whole night awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, the pawn receipt on the nightstand and a cup of cold coffee in my hands. Every so often I looked at it, touched it, as if the letters might explain what my daughter hadn't dared tell me. I knew it was time to face her, and though part of me wanted to wait, let the anger dilute, another part, the stronger one, pushed me forward. As if an inner voice were shouting, there was no room left to keep pretending. Lucy came by after noon. I didn't call, but I suspect Mara, in her endless need to fix the world, told her I'd been with Tomas. She came in with a tired expression, drooping shoulders, lowered eyes. A bag hung from her arm, a mechanical gesture, like someone coming ready for a fight she already knew she'd lose. I said nothing. I just pointed to the dining table, where the receipt was waiting, spread out like a confession written on cheap paper. "What's that?" she asked, though there was no curiosity in her voice, only resignation. "You tell me, Lucy," I answered without looking away. "I found it where it shouldn't be, in your son's backpack, in a corner where truths that shame us get hidden." She stood still, eyes fixed on the paper. Then she sighed, the sort of sigh from someone with no strength left to invent excuses. "I didn't want you to find out this way," she said. "I was going to tell you, but I didn't know how." "Oh, right, because pawning your mother's ring is one of those things hard to bring up between dessert and coffee, isn't it?" Lucy lifted her head. Her eyes were swollen, but dry. "I did it out of necessity." Necessity for what? Lying? Humiliating me? Surviving, Mom? That last word hit me harder than any yell. I looked at her in silence, and suddenly all the anger I'd been storing for days mixed with an old tenderness, the kind you can't put out, even if you try. "Explain," I said, lowering my voice, and she knew she couldn't lie to me anymore. Lucy sat across from me, and, as she spoke, I watched her shrink with each phrase, as if every truth robbed her of air. She told me that for months Jorge had been harassing her, that she'd lost money because of him, that he'd signed a loan in her name when they were still married, and now the interest was choking her. She told me she'd tried to solve it alone, that she'd confronted him, but that he'd threatened her with something she wouldn't say what, and that's why she'd pawned the ring. Only for a while, intending to get it back before I noticed. I listened, without interrupting, without moving. The silence became a mirror where both reflections, hers and mine, looked like worn-out versions of what we once were. When she finished, she lowered her head into her hands. "I swear I was going to get it back, Mom. I never wanted to hurt you." "No, of course," I said slowly. "You wanted to save a coward and used me as a shield." She looked up, and what I saw in her eyes was worse than regret. Shame. Not for what she'd done, but for being discovered. I got up and walked to the window. I needed air. Something to remind me the world kept existing beyond disappointment. "How much did they give you?" I asked without turning. "What? How much did they give you for it? I want to know the price of my story." Lucy was silent. I heard her breathing, trembling, and finally whisper, €120. €120, not even the value of a Sunday meal, not the cost of a memory. I felt a bitter laugh rise from my stomach, one that hurt more than tears. €120 for 50 years of my life. What a cheap betrayal, daughter. She stood up suddenly. "Don't say that, Mom. And what do you want me to say? Thank you? Thank you for selling the only thing that still had my name engraved on it?" Silence filled the house again. Lucy took a step toward me, as if wanting to come close, but I raised my hand to stop her. "Don't touch me," I said. "Not yet. I only wanted to help you." "No, Lucy, you wanted to help that man who destroyed you. You only used me as an excuse." Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't move me anymore. Something in me had hardened, something that might never soften again. She picked up her bag, walked to the door, and before she left, murmured in a voice that barely sounded like hers, "I'm sorry, Mom." I watched her go, her figure disappearing among the garden's trees. I closed the door calmly, no cries, no tears, but with a tremor in my hands I couldn't control. I stood a while, staring at the receipt on the table, that piece of paper that was now all that remained between us. Mara came into the living room, alarmed by our tone of voice. "What happened?" "The truth," I said. "It finally showed up, and what are you going to do?" "Nothing. For now. I've lost enough already." I went upstairs, sat on the bed, and took a deep breath. I looked at my empty hands, the space where a ring used to be, and felt that something inside me had been pawned too, only no one was going to buy it back. I thought of Lucy, of the weight she carried, the fear that made her lie, and though my anger still burned, part of me began to understand. Sometimes people don't steal out of ambition, but desperation. Sometimes children lie to save something they think can still be saved. I closed my eyes, tired. I don't know how long I stayed like that, motionless, listening to the echo of the house, Mara's footsteps in the kitchen, the everyday sounds of a life that kept going in spite of everything. When I opened them, it was already night, and I knew that the next day I'd go further. It wasn't enough to know the ring had been pawned. I wanted to know if it was still there, if I could still get it back. Not for the gold or the memory, but because that would be my way of forgiving her. By returning what she'd lost without knowing that what had broken wasn't an object, but the invisible thread that tied us together. That night, before turning off the light, I spoke to myself quietly, almost as if confessing in front of the mirror. Tomorrow, I'll go look for it, and if I find it, I'll decide what's worth more. The ring, or my daughter. It dawned with a strange wind, the kind that comes from nowhere and slips through the cracks as if carrying news. I dressed without looking in the mirror. I didn't want to see the face I was left with after my talk with Lucy, that mix of exhaustion and contained rage that makes you feel old all at once. In the kitchen, Mara was waiting with a steaming cup of coffee. She handed it to me without a word, and I thanked her with a nod. By now, we didn't need many words. She understood with a look. I sat by the window and thought about what I was going to do, about the pawn shop, about whether it even made sense to look for something I'd already lost inside. But I also knew I couldn't leave it like this. Not for the ring, but because I needed to close that hole chewing on my soul. I asked Mara to come with me, and though she said it wasn't necessary at first, I convinced her. We walked downtown under a sun that had already beaten the wind. The streets were noisy voices and people passing without looking, and suddenly I felt like a stranger among them, as if my grief had no place in a world that kept moving without me. When we arrived, the shop was half empty, smelling of old metal and dust that stuck in your lungs. A man behind the counter greeted us with a tired smile. "I'm looking for a ring," I said before he could ask. "A gold one, with the initials R and E engraved inside." The man raised an eyebrow, used to similar stories, and checked some papers. "You'll have to ask the manager," he said. "If it was pawned, there's a term. If it wasn't reclaimed, it goes to auction." The word auction hit like a blow. I asked him to check anyway, and he disappeared for a moment behind a door. Mara placed a hand on my arm, as if to hold me up. "Easy, Mrs. Elaine." "I'm not nervous, I'm furious," I told her, and she smiled with that sweetness of hers that always disarms me. The man came back with a binder, flipped through slowly, and stopped. "Here it is. Pawned 3 weeks ago and not reclaimed. It was sold in the last auction." I felt the ground vanish under my feet. "Sold? To whom?" "We can't give out names, ma'am. I only have the buyer's code." I asked to see it. He wrote it on a piece of paper. T.R. I stared at it, not understanding. Those 2 letters scrambled my head. T.R. Who the hell was T.R.? Mara looked at me, confused. "Mean anything to you?" the man asked. "Not yet," I answered, "but I'll find out." We left the shop without speaking. We walked in silence to the corner, with the paper clenched between my fingers, and suddenly it clicked. Thomas Rivers. My chest lurched. It couldn't be, or maybe it could. Somehow that noble boy had decided to do what none of us had managed to do. Fix what his mother broke. I asked Mara to let me go alone and headed straight to his school. I waited at the exit, and when I saw him, backpack slung over one shoulder, surprised face at seeing me, I knew my suspicion was right. "Grandma," he said, a mix of affection and fear, "what are you doing here?" "I came to thank you, though I'm not sure if it's for your bravery or your recklessness." He stayed quiet, and in his silence I found my answer. We walked to a nearby bench, sat down, and he told me everything. He'd found the receipt, had been saving for months for a school trip, and when he learned the ring would be lost forever, he decided to buy it himself. He didn't tell his mother because he didn't want to make things worse, and he'd made the payment with a friend's help. The friend put his name on the transfer. I listened without interrupting, and as he spoke, I realized my grandson was more of a man than all the men who'd passed through my life. "You did well, Tomas," I told him, and he looked at me, surprised. "Not because you got it back, but because you had the courage adults sometimes lose." I stroked his cheek and saw in his eyes that shine of relief only those who've carried too big a secret have. We walked home together. Mara opened the door with a nervous smile, and seeing the ring in his hand, because Tomas had it with him, she sighed as if she'd been holding her breath for days. I sat on the living room couch, and he handed it to me. I held it in my palm, looked at it for a long time, and felt a different sadness calmer. It wasn't anger or nostalgia, it was something like forgiveness, though I still didn't know whom for. "Grandma, are you going to give it back to Mom?" Tomas asked, hesitant. "I don't know yet, son. Some things need silence before they can be returned." He nodded, and in his gaze there was understanding, as if he knew not everything can be fixed with gestures, that some wounds need their own time to close. When he left, the house settled into calm again. I stayed alone with the ring on the table, turning it between my fingers. I thought of Lucy, how she'd gotten to this point, and of myself, what I'd done that she felt so desperate. Because not everything was her fault. Maybe my pride weighed more than I'd been willing to admit. Mara came over quietly with a cup of tea and said softly, "You have it back. That should give you peace." "Yes," I answered, "but having something doesn't always mean recovering it." The clock struck 7. Outside, it was getting dark, and the ring's reflection under the lamp seemed to move by itself, as if to remind me there was still something pending. I put it in my pocket not to hide it, but because it didn't feel like time to decide what to do with it. I stood, closed the windows, and as the wind started up again, I knew that tomorrow I would do what needed doing. Gather them all, look them in the eye, and put an end to a silence that was no use to any of us anymore. That night I slept little, but at least without nightmares. Maybe because, for the first time in many days, I had a truth in my hands and a decision in my heart. When I woke, the ring was still there, on the table, waiting like a witness. And I knew it was time for each of us to carry our own share. Morning came with a strange, quiet, not peaceful, but a prelude, like the air thickening just before a storm. I felt it as soon as I opened my eyes. That day everything would blow up, and though I didn't know how or in what tone, I knew I could no longer avoid the inevitable. The ring lay on the living room table, glinting faintly in the sunlight filtering through the curtains as if it too were waiting. I stood there a while, still, thinking how absurd it all was. A small piece of gold turning 3 generations upside down. A circle that had passed through so many hands and left a different imprint on each. I took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and called Lucy. She didn't answer. I sent a short message, almost an order disguised as an invitation. Come home this afternoon. We need to talk. You, me, and your son. I spent the rest of the morning in silence. Mara made lunch without questions, and Carson, who showed up by force of habit with the excuse of returning a book I never lent him, stayed for coffee just to snoop. He watched me with that mix of curiosity and respect men have when they sense a woman is about to do something irreversible. I didn't give him the satisfaction of asking anything. I only told him not to come by for a few days, that I'd be busy settling family matters. He understood and left with that retired detective smile of his, pretending he knew it all. In the afternoon, the sky started filling with dark clouds, as if the weather too were preparing for the meeting. Lucy arrived first, without makeup, face pale and eyes red, dressed like someone who hasn't slept. She came in without looking at me and sat on the couch without taking off her coat. Tomas arrived a few minutes later, and I saw him hesitate at the door, like he didn't want to step into crossfire. I gave him a nod, a silent sign that I trusted him, and that seemed to give him courage. I stood before them both, the ring in my hand. No one spoke. I could hear the clock's tick-tock and the pulse in my temples. This, I said finally, raising the ring, belonged to your father. And to me. For 40 years I kept it not for the gold, but because in this piece of metal were all the promises we made and all the ones we broke. And now it's passed through more hands than a coin. Lucy lowered her head, and Tomas, unsure what to do, glanced at her. I know what you did, I went on, my voice calmer than I felt, and I also know what he did after. Lucy looked up, surprised. Tomas? Yes, I said. Your son bought it. He got it back when you had already lost everything. And not with your money, but with his, with the little he had. She turned to him, incredulous. Is that true? Tomas nodded slowly, unable to meet her eyes. I didn't want the ring to disappear, Mom. I didn't want Grandma to suffer more. A heavy silence fell. Lucy covered her face with her hands and started to cry. But it wasn't the nervous crying from before. This one was different, deeper, more spent, like she'd finally surrendered. I moved closer, set the ring on the table, and spoke without raising my voice. I'm not asking for explanations. I have them already. I just want you to understand what you did. You didn't just pawn a ring, Lucy. You pawned our trust, all of ours, and that can't be redeemed with money. She raised her head, and for the first time in many years, I saw something in her eyes like shame and love at the same time. I know, she said. I was a coward. I thought I could fix it without you finding out, but I ended up breaking everything. No, daughter, I replied. What you broke could be repaired. What hurt was the silence. Tomas, who'd been quiet, spoke up with a trembling voice. Don't blame her, Grandma. She was only trying to protect you. I'm not blaming her, Tomas, I said, looking at him with tenderness. But when you really love someone, you don't protect by lying. You protect by telling the truth, even if it hurts. Lucy stood, came to me, and in a voice, so soft I barely heard it, whispered, I'm sorry, Mom. I know, I replied. But saying sorry doesn't erase what's done, it only opens a door. At that moment, the doorbell rang. The three of us looked at each other, surprised. I opened it, and on the other side was the last shadow of the past I still had to face, Jorge, standing there with an envelope in hand and the haughty look of someone who doesn't understand the wreckage he causes. "I came to drop this off," he said, extending the envelope. "It's the loan receipt. You're not owed anything anymore, neither you nor your daughter." I looked at him in silence, swallowing the urge to tell him what I thought. Lucy, behind me, was shaking. Tomas took a step forward with the anger of a boy watching adults play with other people's lives. "Leave," I told Jorge, without shouting. "You've got nothing to look for here." "I only wanted to help," he tried. "No. You wanted to wash your guilt with money, and money doesn't buy peace." I shut the door in his face without waiting for a reply. Lucy burst into tears again, and Tomas hugged her. I leaned against the door, feeling the tremor run through me. There was some relief in that scene, an odd sense of closure, as if finally all the pieces had fallen into place, even if it hurt. I went back to the living room, picked up the ring, and looked at it under the light. Lucy raised her head and said, voice broken, "If you want to keep it, do." I can't even look at it without feeling guilty. "No," I replied. "It's not mine anymore. Not yours. Not anyone's. What it represents is over. What's left is something else, and that doesn't live in a jewel." Tomas watched us in silence, and I noticed a new calm settling over the house, a different quiet, not of fear, but of ending. I went up to Lucy and stroked her hair like I did when she was little. She rested her head on my shoulder and, for a moment, I felt all the pain of the last few days dissolve a little, that what we'd lost could turn into something less destructive. Maybe a way to finally understand each other as two wounded women, not as mother and daughter at war. The rain started again outside, tapping the windows with that monotonous sound that sometimes seems to cleanse what can't be said. We stayed like that, the three of us, without words. In the center of the table, the ring kept shining, small and silent, like a witness that knew more than it told. And as I looked at it, I knew what I had to do. The sea would receive it the next day. Because there's no better grave for promises than water. Because some stories only find rest when you let them go. At dawn, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that remains after someone has cried all they needed to. Mara made coffee in the kitchen, moving slowly so as not to make noise, and I watched her without speaking, with the sense that the air had changed weight. On the table, the ring rested inside a small box, the same one it had been kept in for decades, as if it had finally found its place to wait for the end. I looked at it for a good while, and understood it was time to release it. Not out of revenge or sadness, but because it no longer belonged to me, or Lucy, or Raphael, or anyone. It was just a worn symbol that had survived longer than it should, like so many promises. I asked Mara not to come with me, that I wanted to do it alone, but she insisted. In the end, I agreed, because there are gestures you can't share, but you can witness. I called Lucy and told her to meet me by the seawall, that she didn't need to bring anything, just herself. She didn't ask why, and that, coming from her, was an act of respect. When I stepped outside, the air smelled of salt and farewells that mix you feel before a change. We walked slowly without speaking, and as the sound of the waves grew, I thought of everything we'd lived through these last days, how a ring had revealed so much of us, what we had to break in order to understand each other again. Lucy arrived soon after, face clean, no trace of tears, and behind her came Tomas, who had insisted on joining her. The three of us stood looking at the sea for a while, that gray horizon that promises nothing but contains everything. We didn't need words. We'd spent them all. I took the box from my purse, opened it, and held the ring in my palm. The morning light made it glint just a little, like a final wink. Lucy looked at me with a face halfway between sorrow and relief. "Are you sure, Mom?" she asked softly, afraid to break something. "More than ever. There are things you have to let go of if you want them to remain yours." Tomas stepped closer, not fully understanding, but with that calm look of someone who already senses the meaning of goodbyes. I took off my coat, walked to the edge, and held out my hand. I felt the cold wind on my skin, the ring's tiny weight between my fingers, and for a second, every memory hit me at once. The wedding, Raphael's nervous laughter, our first home, the arguments, the illness, the silence he left, the years of routine, the loneliness that followed, all of it in a single gesture. I closed my eyes and let it fall. The sound was brief, almost non-existent, a small splash that vanished instantly among the waves. But in that instant, I felt something open inside me, like a stone lifted from my chest. Lucy cried silently, resting her head on my shoulder, and Tomas wrapped his arms around us, an awkward, warm, real hug. We stayed like that for a while, breathing the smell of the sea and listening to the water's murmur. There was no sadness, only a calm I hadn't known in years. I looked at Lucy and saw on her face a different woman, steadier, less afraid. And I understood that everything that had happened, the lie, the ring, the betrayal, had led us to that moment, the only one where we could look at each other without reproach. And, now what? She asked, as if fearing the world might end there. Now we go on, I said, without rings, without debts, without promises, only with what remains. And what remains? Us. I saw her smile, and that small smile was enough. We started walking back. Tomas ran a few steps ahead, laughing with a joy adults forget to have. The wind took the last words I wanted to say to the sea, and as the waves erased the footprints we'd left in the sand, I thought maybe that's life, learning to let the water carry away what weighs, so you can keep walking lighter. When we got home, Mara was waiting with hot tea and respectful silence. She looked into my eyes and understood without asking. I smiled at her for the first time in days, and she nodded with the expression of someone who knows something deep has just happened. That night, after dinner, I was alone in the living room. The house no longer felt empty, but calm. I poured a little wine, turned off the lights, and sat by the window. Outside, the sea kept roaring distant, eternal. I thought of Raphael, how he would have reacted, how much he would have enjoyed seeing me still standing, even without his ring. And I smiled, because in the end, I understood that neither he nor that piece of gold defined my story. I held the glass in my hands and spoke softly, with the steady certainty of someone who has survived herself. You spend half your life holding on so you don't lose things, I said, and the other half learning to let them go so you can stay alive. I drank the last sip, closed my eyes, and listened to the sea like a breath. For the first time in a long time, I felt neither nostalgia nor guilt. Only a simple, clean peace, as if the past had finally understood it had nothing more to do with me. And that's how my story ends, or at least, the part I dare to tell. Sometimes you don't choose what you lose, but you do choose how you go on. If you made it this far, thank you for listening, for staying with me through this piece of truth that still trembles in my hands. Now it's your turn. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place, which part hit you the hardest. I love reading you, truly. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this of love, of losses, of those truths that bite and also save us, subscribe and stay close. I promise to keep talking, even when it hurts.